Thank you for the presentation. So, yeah, apologies for these issues we had with technology, but hopefully you got enough of what we are doing, and maybe we can now finally discuss it all together. And maybe I just kick off the conversation with a quick question myself, and then I would like to invite you, part of the audience, to come on with your questions and really open up the floor. I was really fascinated by this idea that, for instance, if we take the issue of air pollution, you can visualize it, I can absorb it, you can monetize it. If we put together our, let's say, inventions, we already have a system that potentially could work. And this is fascinating because in a way we are what I would consider creative practices, right? And normally creativity is not at the forefront, let's say, of the list when you think about, future innovation, common and so on. It's often the discourse goes into technology, engineering, and so on. So I would like to ask you as a sort of first question, what do you think is the agency of creativity in the near future, or today in the near future? Do you think there is actually a sort of new role to play for creative practices in general across the disciplines that perhaps is enabled by technological innovation, but also it has become really a potentially powerful force of transformation?
Hello? Yeah, great. Okay. I think that it is a really exciting time. What I've noticed, because I've been working for 10 years with scientists, is when I first approached a lot of scientists about 10 years ago, they were really concerned about their research and going forwards with their own sort of academic departments. They're often based in universities. I think scientists have very much changed, and certainly in the UK, but I'm thinking increasingly internationally, scientists, because they do work together across different they often co-author reports from different countries, are really concerned to get the public understanding their science. And they're much more interested now in getting involved with civil society things, working with NGOs, working with artists. And I think that's a real big change. The other thing I think is really a big change in our society is we become such a visual culture. I mean, we can't get off our phones, all of us. We're on our phones all the time. But that means that we are looking at visual images more than ever before. If you think about it, you see people on the train, scroll through. So we are all informed by visual images. So if we want to reach people, we want to reach populations, we want to reach people, we've got to look at the visual. That's got to be really important in terms of communication.
So when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So that's maybe sound non sequitur to the question, but the question, as I interpret it, was, what's the role of creative agency? And so in the innovation that's necessary in the coming days. And so, my answer to that is that it is imperative that we're sourcing our creative inspiration and we allow for disruption of our assumptions around the way that things used to be, and oftentimes that process is, I think that process embodies itself throughout any discipline where you see genius, but we can most clearly see it sometimes in our culture in disciplines that are considered to be the creative disciplines, like music or art, where people's ability to sort of source and channel some sort of intangible flow that just creates something is directly in a linear way related to their success. And the ability to be an amazing scientist or technologist or entrepreneur or policymaker, I would argue, has to come back to that core ability to disrupt our assumptions around the way the world works so that we can reshape that hammer into a tool that actually, meets the present moment. So I think it's a great question and provocation, and it has a lot to do with our ability to engage with agency, I think. Not just...
Yeah, and it sounds like also the where this creativity is based or located is morphing, right? From, let's say, the individual sort of genius to this idea of, let's say, the polycephalum, or this idea of distributed collective intelligence. So perhaps the common itself is where creativity may emerge in different forms, right? So I think let's open up the discussion, because maybe we're already running a little late.
Oh, yes.
And it would be really exciting to hear from you. Is somebody passing the mic, or how do we do?
I wanted to do something else.
Right.
We've had not one, not two, not three, but 4 power cuts. Apologies for that. It means that we're running slightly over time. And I know there's so many questions to this group of speakers here, but they will be around. We can have discussions later over the course of lunch, etc. Because we also want to use this last hour that we have together to work on the tables. Because what we have in mind, and this is cutting it slightly short on this phenomenal panel, but they will join the tables as well. What we have in mind is something really important. Remember what Millie said. All of you work on very different things, very different backgrounds, in very different contexts. But we're asking you to make an incredibly important translation from a series of new practices and new ways of thinking and working with the commons to your own practice going forward after Istanbul Innovation Days. And in the different presentations, there have been a series of design principles and ways of working managed, right? Making the commons visible, using the extraordinary capacity of sensing that new technology brings. Creating new types of contributory networks and contracts, like what Michel Bauwens was talking about, that are these new ennobling technologies, enabling diverse groups of people to become the stewards of a common resource, right? So we're talking here about a series of mechanisms, tools, techniques that can help us go forward in creating the demand for common solutions. And Alice's work, as well as Marco's work, is so powerful in helping people understand the importance of this, as well as the tools of which Regen Network is an incredibly important one, using blockchain to unlock these multi-party contracts. I want to show you this little book here. It's been on your table. You might have been wondering, what is this for? I can make notes in it. Yes, absolutely. But it's a little bit more than that. And in this last hour, we'd like to put you to work. And work with me here, because we have a little bit less time than we thought. And I know you've been sitting through a long session. So I'm going to guide you through a series of questions that will help you make that flip from current practice towards the future. And we're going to do this in a couple of rounds. So take a deep breath, look at the people around you, make sure that everyone is still in the room around the table, right? And take a moment to reflect. Look at page 6 of this booklet. Yeah, could we have the lights up here at the front a little bit? So that all the tables have lights? Can we have lights here at the front a little bit? Great. Okay. Can we have those lights going up here at the front? Okay. Firstly, I'd like to invite you to reflect personally for a couple of minutes. This is great. Thank you. On page 6 and 7, think about the objectives that you have in your own individual practice and the tools you have. Take a minute or two to write these down on page 6 and 7. What are those current objectives and current tools that you have? Take a moment, write it down, and then we'll move on. No, talk about the impact you want to make. Yeah. So what impact do you wish to make? Right, page 6 and 7. What impact do you wish to make, and what tools and work streams do you currently have? Right, both of those questions on both pages. When you have written down some of your thoughts on what impact you want to make and what tools you have, I know that some of you look at me questioningly, but trust me on this one. We flip the page. We flip the page to 12 and 13. Think about the principles. Sorry, to 10 and 11. Think about the principles behind what you were just shown. Page 10 and 11. What principles were behind the presentations that make them work? What makes them different from current practice? We filled in a couple just for you to get started. Huh? Different settings for public debate, the tools of power, sharing them out with the many. Because this is the point, right? We can use these tools to change our current practice going forward after Istanbul Innovation Days. And just to help you in that process, I'm going to ask Alice and Gregory just to re-mention some of those principles that were at the core of their presentation. Yeah?
So one of our core design principles is to make it possible for context-specific agreements between people, to make it possible to give people the tools so that they're able to generate their own set of agreements that match their conditions to generate ecological health. So that sort of is a fundamental underpinning principle for us.
Yeah, I'm been looking at how to make the commons visible. Do we understand the commons? Do ordinary people understand the commons? Looking at science as a universal truth. And maybe if you can get artists and scientists together, you can re-embody that scientific truth. And then to consider different areas of the commons. Maybe air is considered the commons, or the oceans consider the commons. And then my last thing is about making stories about the commons to understand them.
So just to make a point, most of you in this room don't actually work on the topic of commons, right? So you work in other areas. So I think the point to pick up on here is, how do we make the invisible visible, right? So it is very likely that in some instances, state might have monopoly on the information about something, right? So if you are in a position to address that, if we're talking about environmental liability, if we're talking about anti-corruption, if we're talking about human rights, how do you expose the fact that there is somebody who is paying the costs of the fact that social services are not being evenly distributed, right? What is currently invisible and is not factoring into public decision-making that you, through your project, can make visible, right? So the point is to take some of the principles from this work, extract them to a bit of a higher level of abstraction, and then be able to apply them in your own work, and in doing so, stretch what you had planned on doing in a different direction, hopefully inspired by what you've heard.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. And so from our perspective, when you think about peer-to-peer technology and you think about management of the commons, we need to get over the fact that, so governments and non-governmental organizations and corporations and individuals and non-human life are all peers in a network. That's like a fact. And part of our inability to manage change at the moment is our inability to metabolize that fact and then take action accordingly. And so this sort of fundamental principle that we're talking about is how do we, all of us, you know, if you're distilling it to the most abstract, how do you put the agency in the hands of the people who need to make agreements with one another in order to govern the commons? Not how do you make the decisions for them, but how do you bring them the tools so that they can take that action?
Can I just add one point? And it's like, I think something that is interesting about this invisibility is that it doesn't only affect things that are really small. I think it's also a question of things that are really large, because I think today, as we saw, urban networks and infrastructures expands way beyond the limit of cities as we know them, or city centers as such. And so again, our ability to perceive or read the patterns of functioning of these systems at such large scale is very limited. Like, we are simply not equipped as, let's say, biological organisms to comprehend that scale. So of course we use technologies that mediate that, but technologies on their own are not enough. And I think that's again where these are kind of tangible interfaces, whether they are applied to building, to the public realm, whether they are digital interfaces, whether they are wearable interfaces, all of these ways of interfacing our body and our cognitive systems with these incommensurable scales is, I think, a kind of fundamental step to be able to expand this notion of commons, as we said, and really address the complexity of the ecological problem.
So, having done that, and I see lots of you scribbling, now the point is to make one more step on your own and take a couple of minutes to start applying what these ideas could mean for your work. Now, and we're going to be talking about this as a group as well, because we want to hear from you. But can some of these principles be applied to your work? Huh? Creating a new politics of change through increasing visibility of shared problems, new contract structures that enable distributed agreements for common good, etc. How can you apply these to your work? That's on the next page, page 12 and 13. Take a few moments, write them down yourself, and then we're going to be discussing this together. Join the table, I think, at this point, because from here on, we're going to start discussing at the table. So here's both the silence of hard work and emerging conversations. And at this point in time, we'd like to open your conversations up around the table to each other. So it's great to start sharing what it is you're thinking about. What are these mechanisms that for you are most powerful? How could they be applied? And what kind of new projects could come out of this? What would you love to be doing? And what do you think you should be doing after IID? Now, what you'll see is on your table, of course, this big mat. And this mat is there for you to scribble on as you discuss with each other. The outer ring in blue is about these mechanisms and principles of change. The politics of change, making the invisible visible, new contract structures, etc. Feel free to scribble on it. The next point is about the ideas, new applications, new ways in which you can do your work differently. Discuss it with your neighbors. Discuss it as a table, because we want to know what it is you're thinking collectively about the projects that you could be doing next. Yeah. You'll have, for this round, you'll have plenty of time. You'll have about 20 minutes to do this together, right? With the idea of giving feedback on each other's ideas, sharing what it is you think you could be doing, sharing what it is you're learning, and what makes these ideas fresh and exciting. Yes. Okay.
Is there a table that I should?
I don't know which table has enough facilitator.
Tables are doing quite okay, so do we need to join them?
Some of them are facilitating.
So look which table.
Yeah, I also don't know.
Look at which tables look happy. If they're happy and discussing with each other, leave them do it. If you think there's a table where lots of people wondering what to do, join that table. Yeah?
This is why now it might look a bit strange that we
If we're like,
jump in
yeah.
here.
Hello? Yeah. Sorry. Hello, friends. So we're not shutting off yet. This is a 7-minute kind of trigger, right? We're gonna bring back the conversations, but I wanted to get back to why are we having this conversation, right? Let's keep an eye. The biggest failures that we're seeing are actually the failures of our common goods, right? Air pollution, carbon, these are environmental licensing, all of this stuff, these are common good failures. Many, many of them that we're seeing. What we've seen is brilliant examples here, right, of looking at an architecture of contracting and infrastructure which allows us to reframe the relationship to the commons in ways that we've never been able to do. Typical contracting is one-to-one. When you do many-to-many contractings, can you fundamentally imagine a new paradigm? Look at the High Line in New York. Massive, massive public good. Entirely privatized in the hands of private corporates on one side. Could that be in a different relationship? Actually, does Regen Network and the experiments they're doing fundamentally allow for a different relationship between common goods and private goods? Does invisible dust in the articulation of the commons allow for a new politic to emerge, right? If you visualize the commons and the implication, does that allow for a new politic to emerge and the convenience, and as a result, a new legitimacy to drive change? So what we've been seeing is some of these examples which apply. Now start to imagine in all the other common areas that you think about how these sort of things could be used and thought about, right? So I think these are extraordinary indicators of a different way of seeing. I would put forward to you one of the big paradigm shifts we're going to see is going from private value business models to common goods infrastructures. That is probably the paradigm shift that we're seeing as a result of these new technologies, right? And fundamentally, it's critical. So how do we start to think about that is really important. And it's an opportunity for us to experiment with other domains as a result of that. That's why these experiments were on the table, to give us a field to think about this stuff. So 7 minutes, Joost, 7 minutes to start to
decide with your table. So take a few minutes to wrap up your discussion and decide with your table which of the experiments that you've been talking about at your table you want to feed back to this whole group. So this does not have to be a summary of everything that's been discussed at the table, not a cross-cut of all the ideas that have been mentioned. It's about 1 or 2 individual ideas at your table which you would want to share with the group, so that we start to have a sense collectively of what these experiments could look like, right? So think about this together. Which idea, which prototype, which potential experiment do you want to share from everything that you individually have been thinking about and collectively been discussing with this group? Go for it. We'll come back to you in a couple of minutes. Okay. It is sharing time. There's lots and lots of conversations kicking off at the tables. This is great. What we're going to do now, as we wrap up, I would love for each table to share one idea that has come up in a table. That might be an individual's idea, that might be a joint idea, and please go through, when you explain it, just in a few minutes, through the mechanisms that you've applied and the idea that's come out. I know that some of you want to keep talking and want to keep discussing. That's great. That's the appetite in the room. That's fantastic. And we'll have more rounds of this. So who will be sharing? There we go. So you have 2 minutes each, because we want to hear from each table your best idea. There you go. Don't worry about that.
Okay. Hello, my name is Natia Natslushvili. I'm coming from UNDP Turkmenistan. First of all, thank you very much to the speakers. It was absolutely amazing presentations, and it did inspire me certainly, and I hope my table also to come up with an idea. The problem that is prevailing in Turkmenistan and most of the Central Asia is land degradation. The land is degraded and the land is salty. You wouldn't imagine, those who haven't seen the salty land, what it means. You go and the salt is there like a snow. This is bad for agriculture. This is impossible for agriculture effectively. And one cause of this degradation is inefficient use of water. Over-irrigation and inefficient application of water for over years has been magnifying the problem of the land degradation and salination of the land. So here is our idea. I don't know if scientists or technologists, innovators, those especially who work on the biological methods, can create a bacteria or an organism or a microorganism which can eat that salt from the land. The salt is also toxic. It is not the salt that we use in our dishes, so it's not for us to eat those. Bacteria eating the salt, that's somehow processing that and then creating a good salt from this toxic. It might be fantastic at this moment, but maybe at one point we arrive there. But then applying these methodologies then requires this new norms of social contracting, or the new norms of contracting we were talking. Why? Because many players must take part in this very critical project. First, scientists. I come from UNDP. I have no idea how to create this bacteria. Second, this is government. Government needs to buy in. Government needs to definitely take on this on board. But third, this is farmers. These are the smallholder farmers who still use these very devastating irrigation practices. They should all agree, all without exception, to stop using that practice and use these new technologies, new methodology, to make sure that this land is treated as a whole. Treating one little piece doesn't make an impact. It should be treated holistically. So I think this idea has all the elements. Here it is for you to help us create now these solutions to this. Thank you.
I'm going to the next table. Are you ready?
Great. Okay. So we have
a slightly less developed idea. We're still very early pre-preconception stages maybe. So I think what our table was really focused on was around how great the panelists brought into play how to make the invisible visible. And we spoke about from different actors. We don't want to put labels on anything, but using social media with the youth, or perhaps using eco-asset budgeting with government, or perhaps looking for communities of experimental context in a place that, you know, using the commons to create an environment where we can set up new rules and protocols. So I guess, I think our team is still figuring out things, to be honest.
Thank you. How about this table? You.
Okay.
Go for it.
So hello everyone. In our table we discussed about two issues, which perhaps has not to do directly with these big commons that were represented here, but they have to do with some commons we should fix in the country where most of us in this table come from Albania. One thing we thought that we should change it, we should give more importance in this coming year, has to do with building integrity in our institution in order to fight corruption. So building more integrity in public institutions which give direct services to the citizens in order to fight corruption. And also joining these efforts in the public institutions with the other relevant sectors or actors which are at the same field. One new thing that was also proposed this from our colleague from UNDP here in our table, it was to organize peer-to-peer check on integrity from in different institutions in Albania. So not only building, so owning and building integrity rules and plans in our institution, but also checking them from one another in order that we know more, and we do not only learn through this process, but we also can improve and can find new ways to improve it. And the other thing had to do with the citizen participation in the decision-making processes and in changing different perspectives of our everyday life or of policy-making processes. So although there are steps forwards done through these electronic platforms where citizens are invited to present their ideas and to participate, and also through a lot of services we provide to the citizens, which give them the possibility to be present in the everyday work of our public institutions, we need to change perhaps to reshape the way we see this public participation in our institutions. So making them more present through their ideas, proposals, and asking for clear results at the end. So thank you.
Fantastic. A prototype around peer-to-peer, there was many prototypes in there, a prototype around peer-to-peer verification around integrity of institutions. I'm coming to the next table.
So our discussion was more of a journey than reaching a destination. But we particularly were intrigued by the idea of making the invisible visible. And felt that this is a very important dimension of the commons. I think the other key element was how we use technology to scale development interventions, that the development sector has struggled with scale, and part of what we took there was the need to think in terms of using platforms to get to scale. What we also discussed was the new forms of contracting that were there are also new forms of social contract. And underlying those social contracts, there are two question marks. The one is, how does that get resourced? What is the resourcing process for making the invisible visible? And within our current incentive models, we see challenges. We looked at the social contracting dimension. The question we also had was the issue of social process. So we looked at a number of different applications. We looked at support for people with disabilities as part of the commons. We had an advocate of universal basic income. We also had an advocate of using employment to address the problems of the commons. But in relation to all of those examples, an underlying question was, what are the social processes that need to go along with these applications and these instruments, that they don't work on their own. They have to be underpinned by processes of organization, and we found ourselves slipping into what may still be old mental models, but about how one builds social movements to underpin the use of these new applications, the use of these new processes. And I think that's where we ended up.
Fantastic. Both the social movement angle.
Just quickly, I think that's a really important point, because actually what we're seeing in all of this stuff is that actually a lot of the real work is future of accounting, right? So future of accounting, Gibson, a town in Canada, has put an aquifer on the balance sheet of a town, a water aquifer on the balance sheet. So how do we know in social impact bonds, European Union is putting $1 billion down for outcome buying, for integrated outcome buying. How do we start to do that with environmental goods, public goods in a different format? How do we account for this stuff is going to be fundamental and on the table. So when we look at this stuff, the contracting is one layer. Then there's actually, whether it's accounting and other governance tools which are fundamental in building the process, there's an ecosystem of problems behind it, which are really, really important. Thanks.
Thank you. And applause, yes. Next table. Who takes the mic? There you go.
Hello, everyone. I'm Louise from UNDP China. Yes, I traveled 11 hours from Beijing to here. It's very exciting, and thanks to my group for nominating my rough idea. So China, which was largely cited today in many presentations. As a Chinese national born and raised, I've seen this big gap. So on one hand, what's the number again? 40% of the VC on artificial intelligence are invested in China. And also someone mentioned the GAFA, the Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Airbnb, I think, in America. But in China, we have BAT, B-A-T, the Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. Yeah. So the gap that UNDP China country office is seeing is that there are untapped potential on the national capacity of China on technology and innovation, whereas it's not sufficiently used due to many political and other reasons. So with the trend of Chinese government going more abroad and also private sectors in China, especially in the tech industry, wanting to do CSR projects elsewhere, outside China, our country office is thinking about to set up a mechanism, roughly now we call it the solution exchange platform, where we want to really to bridge the national capacity of innovation in China to help other developing countries through the framework of South-South cooperation and then Belt and Road Initiative. So that's the rough idea. Thank you.
I'm moving over here.
Hello, Ray Boyle, UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub. We started with a couple of the principles, namely around visualizing the invisible, and then taking a regenerative systems approach. So where we started was, what does it look like to visualize population flows around Eastern Europe and the CIS region as it impacts economies and sort of tax distribution. And then we moved into some really interesting conversations on what kind of visualization would be possible if we took it from micro to macro. And how we got there was around systems of governance. And when we talk about government, or individuals or communities. We're not seeing that sort of regenerative picture that we had from headwaters to the ocean. There's an individual in government. So using these different thoughts around the table, there is an idea to sort of examine the inflow and the outflow of kitchens at a very individual level, except around a city perhaps, to see how much food comes in, how much waste goes out, where are the systems in place and sort of the missing parts of the system to take care of the circularness of it. And then how does that then inform sort of a residential picture of access to food? What is the agricultural justice map of that city perhaps? And then how can that inform perhaps transportation or urban agriculture to insist on different policy measures? And then inside of the circular aspect, once those policies are in place as a reflection from the kitchen sort of to the collective table, how have those then redistributed those flows in those individual kitchens, perhaps 6, 10 months, a year down the line? Are those kitchens now able to be more circular? Can they reduce their waste and their carbon footprint? But then what does that look like at sort of the economies of scale? So obviously this requires a forcing function of these tables turning into policy, but really making sure that we're not separating the individual from the governance structures that hopefully are responsive.
Fantastic. Next generation mapping and information sharing platform around food and food waste. Fantastic.
Hello. All right. So we don't have an idea, but we have more of a takeaway, I guess. So we talked about the importance of visuals and visualizations, especially when it comes to air pollution. And often it's hard to see the effects of pollution. So I think people would pay more attention if things were right in front of them, if it was more visual. So especially the project about the invisible dust project that talked about the costumes. So we thought of other ways where pollution can be more, you could visualize pollution. So that was it.
Visualizing air pollution, a prototype around next generation shared intelligence tools. Thank you. I think you are next.
Yes, thank you. I'm Valbona. I'm from Albania. And my group, we talked about a lot of things that everybody shared, but we wanted to focus in the arts and culture as something that is very important for everything in this world, from experimenting, from creating, to coming up with products or ideas. So the problem that we have in Albania is that there's a law for sponsorship in the arts, culture, and the sports that doesn't function. So my objective, what I want to get out of this conference, is how to bring people together in drafting a law on sponsorship through using common, what's the word, sorry? Common platforms as something that was previously used in Iceland for with drafting their constitution, something that we could use in doing the same but for in Albania. How to use collaborative platforms, how to use technology, what kind of help would we need for donors such as UNDP and other donors, which is not necessarily funds, but more experts of how they did it before what we want to do, and how do we implement it, the same thing in Albania. How to mobilize different levels of education, point of views coming from businesses, from artists, from creative people, from teachers, from parents, how to bring them all together in drafting this law and how to share the common goods. How to bring the collective action in play, multi-dimensional agenda, and how to negotiate the common agreement, actually. This was one problem that they raised. Just because it's out there and because everybody's sharing their thoughts on what the sponsorship law should be doesn't mean that necessarily everybody agrees to the final product. So how to come up with this decision on what everybody decides it's final. So this is very inspiring for me, and if it works in Albania, it might be like a domino effect to function to work in other development of other laws or platforms or policy papers or policies. So it would be very, very nice if I can come back after a year or say it works. And I would actually ask everybody's help to accomplish this. All right? Thank you.
And thank you also for highlighting what it is that UNDP can do to support you in building these prototypes and building these experimental infrastructures. Thank you. Now I come to what I think is the last table. Am I right?
Hi, I'm Cecily from Service Lab, Georgia. So we discussed many different topics and ideas, but I think something that was common for all of us sitting around this table, and we come from different countries, was that we all fight and struggle for the air pollution. So what we wanted to see more is have every citizen, everyone involved in the process responsible for their share of the air pollution, and have them understand that they can contribute to it and they can solve the problem as well. So we wanted to see and apply the behavioral insights to the process, and provide the sensors across the cities and towns where the population can see the level of air pollution in a live way, and then next to it show like the cities that are doing well with it, what is the level of air pollution there, and to nudge them to decrease the air pollution in their areas, and also nudge the healthy competition between the cities and between the districts within one city to lower the level of air pollution. So this was our idea. Thank you.
Unlocking a new form of social contract, even by healthy gaming and competition, in order to inform the policy formation process. Have I missed out anyone? I don't think I have. It's nearly a wrap. It's time for lunch. What I wanted to say is two things. We've discussed across many levels, and I think I sense that many of you would have liked more time in your groups to have these discussions with your colleagues, and we will work with that. Now, you have started to make the flip between the current practices in your organization, the current aim, the current objectives that you have, and new ways of working, and starting to formulate prototypes and experiments. The process of formulating prototypes and experiments is difficult. There is no doubt about it. But we will continue on this journey over the next series of sessions. You have your playbook, which is personal, right? That's where your notes are, where your emerging ideas are, where the thoughts are that you might want to share with colleagues when you go back. I saw many of you writing your names on it. Hold on to it. Take it with you for the duration of the sessions, because we'll also use it for the next series of sessions. We will also be inputting, not just in these table mats, but after lunch into an online big brain that harvests some of the best ideas, as well as some of your questions on concerns that you have. We will talk about that after lunch. But for now, I would like you to join me in thanking, first of all, the speakers, Michel, Gregory, Daniel, Alice, and Marco, who under no easy circumstances, I've never been part of a session with 4 blackouts, have shared with you a series of design principles and mechanisms of new ways of working. Thank you very much for your participation and hard work, and see you after lunch.